So we are now at session 7, moving right along through this morning's agenda. And session 7 is we're going to be discussing right now the environmental benefits of passenger rail service. It's been mentioned more than a few times here already in the last day or so that rail service is a way to reduce carbon emissions and to help improve our environment. In more ways than that, actually, as Elaine brought out about, the fact that, the highways that run along our iconic western rivers, be it the Columbia or the Snake or the Yellowstone, that there's been a lot of recent studies done about how the negative impacts of tire particles going into those rivers and that kind of thing. So bottom line is the more passenger trains we can put on the rails and the more people we can get to travel by passenger train, the better it is for our climate and our environment. And so that's what this session is about. Our moderator of this session is Mr. Charles Hamilton here. Charlie's with All Aboard Washington and All Aboard Northwest. And joining him are remotely, we've got Tim Good from the Sierra Club of Washington. We've got Kat Dobbs with
HDR.
Jacobs, or HDR, sorry, Kat. Deva Katila, I probably butchered that too, with with Jacobs Engineering, and Abe Zumwalt with David L. Evans and Associates. So thank you guys for joining on this panel, and Charlie, I'm going to turn this over to you.
Thank you very much. And I am one of the other categories of people who ride trains, those of us who are somewhat disabled, which is why I'm sitting down. So, Tim, I believe Tim is remote, and we'll let him start. Good morning, Tim.
Oh, no. We're trying to get Tim on.
Oh, okay. Well, then, do we want to switch?
Kat go first anyway. So.
Kat? All right. Well, let's let Kat go on, and then we'll come back to Tim.
Hello?
Yep.
Hi. So would you believe me if I told you I am not Spencer Dodge? But I do have the great pleasure of working with Spencer Dodge. I am with HDR Engineering. I am out of the Portland, Oregon office, and I also spent several years in Washington, D.C., kind of in the trenches doing NEPA and environmental evaluations, actually with my friends at the FRA. I was there for several years. And so today, I want to say, just in contrast to yesterday, what really strikes me about, even if you look at the title of this session, Session 7, is that we are focusing on environmental benefits. Now, contrast that to the sessions that we had yesterday, economics, for example, where we would focus on economic impacts and benefits. And I have to say, from my perspective, as someone who has been in the trenches doing NEPA work for many years, I really, really like this approach. Because I think that for most people who have been through the project development process, who have worked with a federal agency, not just on rail, but any transportation process, when you think about environmental, unfortunately, the trigger is not typically positive. When you think of environmental, you are much more likely to think of an onerous and rigorous, long, drawn-out, slow, burdensome NEPA process. And I think that that's really unfortunate because I think that that really loses the benefit that transportation, and in particularly rail transportation, can deliver to be really transformative to communities and transformative to the human and the built environment, which is something, of course, that we all have to look through in those project development phases through the NEPA lens and under the NEPA umbrella. So to have a panel that focuses on benefits, I think, is great. But that doesn't really eliminate the fact that, I mean, it wouldn't do anyone here any service just to talk exclusively about the environmental benefits that rail can deliver, the transformational qualities that passenger rail has for communities, both for the human environment, for the riders, but also for the built and natural environment in terms of climate change, emission reductions, and all of the goals that contribute overall to a healthier and happier environment and community. So I think that the good news is that under the IIJA and in the Biden administration's many of the supporting pieces of legislation and executive orders, that we really are have a unique opportunity to use the NEPA process, but also the sort of pre-NEPA planning processes to really look and identify those transformational environmental benefits that projects really can have and can deliver to riders of passenger rail projects and to the communities. But that doesn't mean that we get to overlook the NEPA process. And the NEPA process historically has been, for those of us who've been through it, it's been very impact focused. And this leads me back to, I think, a great point that was made yesterday that is just as applicable to environment as it is to economics. You have to build it and you have to start the service before you can realize the benefits. And that same thing is true when you look and you're talking about environmental impacts and realizing those environmental benefits. Infrastructure projects impact the environment. Now, rail infrastructure projects have the potential to impact the environment significantly less than other projects, particularly when you look at them as a part of a holistic transportation network. But that does not change the fact that if you're going to deliver a rail service, there's going to need to be infrastructure improvements. You might need to build new bridges. You're going to have to comply with the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, all of the umbrella pieces of legislation. But we are now at that time when we can start to look at the transformational environmental benefits that rail projects and transportation projects can have, and really to analyze them in terms of equity and distributing those benefits to the folks who have traditionally been more marginalized by transportation projects. I mean, NEPA as a law exists for very real reasons. Transportation has not been equitably built and distributed in this country. But now, through the environmental lens and sort of in partnership with NEPA, I know that I'm really excited about the opportunity to focus more on the benefits and realizing and distributing those benefits to all of the riders and the users, but also in ways that will benefit communities overall.
Great, thank you. That's a terrific start. Is Tim available yet? Yeah. All right, let's bring Tim in. This is Tim Gould, representing the Sierra Club of Washington State. Good morning, Tim.
Good morning, and good morning to everyone there in Billings. I'm glad to be able to join remotely. I'm sorry I couldn't be there in person. But is the presentation that I provided, is that up?
I believe it is available. Yes, there it is. Go ahead, Tim.
Okay, very good. So again, my name's Tim Gould. I've done a lot of transportation-related activism on behalf of Sierra Club, and also I'm a longtime member of Rail Passengers Association, and also All Aboard Washington. Why don't you go ahead to the next slide, please? So I wanted to talk about the role of rail as a major climate solution to the climate crisis that we face. And it really comes down to the simple matter of this pie chart distribution of the sources of transportation greenhouse gas emissions. You know, rail is a very small sector. And, you know, by contrast, you're looking at about 83% of all transportation greenhouse gases coming from highway vehicles. And also, I might add that nationwide, the transportation sector is the single largest, somewhere on the order of about roughly 30% of greenhouse gas emissions. And so it's really clear that if we can shift both passenger and freight travel from highways to rail, that would be a major part of a climate solution. And it really comes down to a matter of the energy efficiency ability of trains to operate much more energy efficiently. If you go to the next slide, the advantages are basically that for the same distance or weight of cargo that's hauled, a train is going to use 1/3 the energy of a rubber tired vehicle. And it's kind of a simple matter of the physics of much less rolling resistance with steel wheel on steel rail. And so you get that energy efficiency, which means also therefore less emissions, no matter what kind of fuel is being used. And so this really points to the benefit, the need of being able to make these shifts and get both passenger and freight onto rail transit. Less accidents, you're certainly improving the air quality and public health in that case. Many highly impacted communities are close to major highways with lots of freight traffic. We see that in city after city, metropolitan area after metropolitan area all over the country. And so the big advantage there is to shift to rail and realize those benefits in terms of less energy used, less emissions. Next slide. But what a lot of environmental advocates would really like to see is to electrify that rail. We hear a lot about, well, we need to shift to electric vehicles, and the focus has been all on rubber-tired passenger cars and trucks as far as EVs are concerned. But I would just like to bring up the point that an electrified train is actually far better for a number of reasons. And again, that energy savings is kind of paramount there, but also by using overhead wire instead of battery locomotives, there would be a savings in weight, and it's much less resource intensive compared with the various rare earth metals that are required for batteries. We really don't have enough, given the need to scale up to electric vehicles. If we were to replace all fossil fuel vehicles with electric, we'd have all kinds of material shortages for batteries. And so again, providing the mode shift onto rail is very important. Also, I might point out there about the regenerative braking. Electric locomotives going downhill are actually able to feed energy back into the grid. And another example where rail has a major advantage over rubber-tired vehicles is in some of the other types of pollution. And this is especially a problem for tire dust. Tire wear particles actually contribute something on the order of around 3 to 7% of the total fine particulate matter in the air. That was according to a study of some university researchers in the Netherlands. If you go to the next slide, another major problem of tire dust is toxicity of some of those compounds for fish species. In the Pacific Northwest, the University of Washington Tacoma did a very extensive study and identified a particular derivative compound from tire rubber that was actually causing coho salmon to be killed whenever there was a large rainfall runoff event. They'd find that the coho salmon in the area of those major roads impacted by runoff were dying off. So if you go to the next slide, in addition to these inherent effects with rail, I'd also like to point out how communities designed around rail stations and rail lines also tend to be less impactful on the environment. We can't really transition our way fast enough to electric vehicles. We need to reduce vehicle miles traveled, as well as reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And so where you have train stations with cities and towns built up around those, where that's a hub or a core for the local transit network, you get a lot more compact development. And what you find is that there's just a lot less environmental impact from that compact development pattern. This particular graph I've got up here is just showing how, with the number of households per residential acre increasing, you end up seeing less vehicle miles traveled per household on an annual basis. And there are three examples there for San Francisco, Los Angeles, and Chicago that all track each other very well. So, clearly, if we can promote passenger rail and build our towns and cities around those stations and around the network, that will definitely lead to environmental benefits and a better quality of life for those that have those benefits. So thank you. I look forward to our discussion.
Thank you, Tim. Stick around. I'm sure there will be questions. So let's move next to Dava Katala from Jacobs.
Okay. Hey, it worked. Sorry, we're not really sure up here how we turn on and off the mic, so we're winging it. So I'm Dava Kaitala, and I'm with Jacobs. I've been here for about 18 months. Before I was at Jacobs, I was at BNSF Railway for a little over 12 years, where I was lucky enough to be part of the environmental leadership team and head up their sustainability program, as well as their planning and permitting program, which means I did all of their NEPA. Before I was at BNSF, I was a NEPA attorney for the Corps of Engineers. So I've spent way more years than I should admit in public doing stuff involved with NEPA. And interestingly, the Corps, you guys might know, is responsible for what is referred to as the water highway system in America, which means they deal with all of the barges that move over rivers and things. So I'm well versed in the environmental benefits and impacts of barge traffic as well. And what was really interesting to me when I was at BNSF was we would always talk about being the most efficient mode of land transportation. And that's true. Rail is by far, as Tim just mentioned, the most efficient mode of land transportation when it comes to carbon. What I would argue, and argued for 12 years, is that from a pure environmental standpoint, looking at all of the different types of environmental impacts, rail is the most environmentally friendly, because when you look at things moving by barges, which granted, from a carbon standpoint, barges are extremely efficient, but you have to dredge. And so with the people at the Corps, with my environmental folks, I had an agreement that if they were going to show me pictures of frogs that were disfigured, they had to flag the pages. Because I, after a while, started feeling like I had PTSD, because I would be reviewing these NEPA documents, and it would be a whole lot of what are the impacts of dredging, and they're significant. So it's something to think about. So what I wanted to talk about today was really all of those environmental benefits and impacts that have nothing to do with carbon, because very often they're overlooked. And in particular today, I wanted to talk about land use. So if you look at the typical highway, they say it's 200 feet wide for 2 lanes in either direction. I think it's actually closer to 250 feet if you consider that the requirements are that you have a 60-foot median, you need, 11 feet per lane, then you need shoulders. So it's really closer to 250 feet when you do the math. But let's make the math easy, because I went to law school, so I got to quit doing math. A typical highway being 200 feet wide, that means that you're using 24 acres of land per mile. The average rail right-of-way, this varies wildly, but the average is 100 feet. So we're talking about half the amount of land that's lost for other uses when you're moving to rail instead of a highway. And the amount of stuff, the amount of trains that you can put on that same amount of land, that 100-foot strip as opposed to 200 to 250-foot strip, is pretty amazing. Does anybody here, BNSF folks, you're not allowed to answer this because you know the answer. A double stacked train, so one that you see where it's 2 containers high. Do you guys know how many trucks that takes off the road? One train. 280. 280 18-wheelers come off the road. That is significant. So when you're looking at that, if you're looking at 12 acres of land per mile instead of 24, here's some of the other things that you need to think about. When the railroads were built, I joke railroad engineers are much like water. They took the path of least physical resistance. So if you ever look at the entire kind of rail system in the United States, you'll see that they run very close to rivers, which means there's a lot of wetlands that have to be considered. That's actually why BNSF hired me originally. I was a wetlands expert from the Corps. I could help them figure out how to lessen wetland impacts as they were building projects. That was a big part of my job all 12 years I was there, even moving from job to job. So if you think about the environmental benefits that wetlands give us, they are nature's way of cleaning our water system. They are biodiverse like you would not believe. They are the habitat for some really incredible species, particularly plant species. So when people think about endangered species, they generally think about the cute ones. They think about the field mouse. They think about grizzly bears. They don't think about bats. They don't think about the blind salamanders in Austin. But the cute ones. But what they don't think about are the vast majority of species that are on the list are invertebrates and plants. So wetland areas are a place where really you have these wonderful plant species that are coming along. Same is true of roads. So if you're taking twice the amount of acreage, you can't really have a high quality wetland in a median of a highway. You can have a little bit of a wetland impact. You can build some wetlands there, but because they aren't big enough, and because you got to figure out how to get the critters there without getting hit by a car, it's not really a great wetland. So wetlands are something that I could talk about all day long because I'm very excited about them. But it's something to think about. In addition, if you think about the endangered species and how they move, and if you think about what a highway looks like versus a railroad, highways, the traffic happens sort of all the time. It ebbs and flows some with 5 o'clock traffic with rush hour and things, but there's always the possibility that cars are going to be coming along. Trains, because you have 200, the equivalent of 280 trucks all coming at the same time, you open up wildlife corridors in a very different way. There's simply more time for species to cross in a manner that is safe than you do with a road. Now, that's not to say that trains never hit endangered species. I spent a significant amount of time when I was at BNSF being concerned about hitting grizzly bears in Glacier National Park. And BNSF, if you ever want to hear about their program, they have this incredible program of all the things that they layered one on top of another. From every time they hit a deer or anything else, they call somebody to come clean it up so the bears aren't coming to eat them, to picking up grain so that it doesn't ferment, which the smell of fermented grain apparently is like the best filet mignon smell to bears. So they do all of these amazing things and really have gotten their bear strikes down to almost nothing. You can't do the same thing for a road. So just the way that rail traffic works, you get environmental benefits over highways. Now, something I wanted to point out about, we keep talking about this roads versus rail versus, in my case, versus barges. The reason for that is this. When you look at NEPA as a statute, NEPA is a comparative statute that really is a way for federal agencies to make decisions. That's the whole point of NEPA. NEPA doesn't drive a particular process, but it makes you compare one to another so that you look at the benefits and impacts of different modes. So when we talk about it that way, that's why. It's because that is how the decision makers have to make their decision. They always have to look at something called the no impact alternative. And what's interesting when you're talking about passenger rail is the no impact alternative, which is required by NEPA. Every project has to look at it. You can't say no more people are going to move than move today. The fact is that under the no impact alternative, what that means is more people are moving by car or bus, but they're moving by a transportation system that is not rail. So when you're looking at adding passenger rail, what you're really looking at in a very real way is the benefit of taking cars off the road. And when you're looking at it for freight, it's taking trucks off the road. So that's how you get to all of these really great carbon benefits. It's how you get to the benefits for land use, the fact that in areas like Montana that are highly agricultural, you're taking less agricultural land out of production. You know, if you have areas that could be used for recreation and the tourism benefits that come from that, you're taking less of that out of production. And then just kind of a fun story. When I first started at BNSF, I was lucky enough to go to this place called the Tehachapi Pass that's in Southern California. Tehachapi Pass is super cool because it is one of the only places I can think of in the United States, because of the terrain, where a locomotive engineer can see the tail of his own train as he's going around the mountains. So it's just a really cool place. BNSF and UP both run there. But what was interesting was we were up on a ranch. We had permission. We weren't just out there trespassing. So we were up on a ranch. We were looking at the railroad from above. So we were looking down, and then we had to walk, I would say, 200 yards. And then we were looking down at the freeway. And when we were on the freeway side, it was loud, it was smelly. The cattle were like literally edging away from it. You could hear horns honking because it was a huge highway. And then you walked the 200 yards and you looked down at the railroad and you could see the cattle who were grazing along the rail line. And it was very bucolic. It was very much like 200 yards moved you back in time, in a really positive way. So that was the first time on the railroad, and I'd literally been with the railroad maybe 3 months at the time. It was the first time that I really had an understanding of how much better the land use was when you were looking at moving things by rail or people by rail as opposed to moving them by highways. So with that, I will turn it over.
Thank you, Dava. Many of us who've been to Glacier National Park have heard the fermented grain and the grizzly bear story. It's apparently very popular to tell out there.
Y'all want me to tell the drunk bear story?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, I love the drunk bear story. So this was also when I was very new to BNSF. We had an environmental guy who was based here in Montana, and there had been this time period when BNSF was hitting a lot of grizzly bears, and we couldn't figure out why. And everyone who hit, every locomotive engineer told the same story. They would say, I do not care what anybody says, that bear was dead. It was dead on the tracks. We saw it ahead of time. We honked the horn. The bear was not moving. Like, the bear was dead. I did not kill that bear. That bear was dead on our tracks. But this happened over and over again. What they finally figured out was, what was happening was when there was a grain spill, the grain would, sometimes they buried the grain. This was in I think, the 80s and in the early 90s. So they would bury the grain, or the grain would just get buried because it was sitting there and it would ferment. Well, bears eat everything. Like, they will eat, they're like, you know, I don't know, they will eat anything that comes in front of them. Dead, alive, they don't care. But as a result, they have to eat fermented stuff to help their body digest all this gross stuff that they eat. So what was happening was this grain would ferment, they'd get drunk, and they'd pass out on the tracks. So we were literally hitting drunk bears. We figured this out because we started doing autopsies on the bears because we were like, why are they passing out on our tracks? So that's part of the reason now BNSF picks up grain, is to stop drunk bears. So my guy who had a really funny sense of humor, which maybe wasn't, executive level all the time. He says to our executives, he's like, so, what really needs to happen, normally these bears eat fermented berries, so, it's like wine, but now they're on the hard stuff. So I don't know how we're gonna get them back to eating berries. And so our poor executives were like, do we need to put wine out? Could we get wine? What do we do? And he was like, no, it was a joke. So anyway, that's the drunk bear story.
Thank you very much. I've heard that story before, but it was great to hear it again. And I will just say, next time you're on the road with your kids and your grandkids, have them count up to 280 trucks. I think that would be a really cool thing to do. So with that, let's move on to Abe Zumwalt.
I'm going to try to follow that. That's fantastic.
Yeah, right.
My name is Abe Zumwalt. I'm a transportation economist and planner with David Evans and Associates, and before that, I worked for 7 years with the Rail Passengers Association, who've taken kind of a prominent role at this conference. But I have a presentation that I wanted to share to follow all of this up. Is it available and ready to go?
We're looking for it.
Yeah. Well, to fill the void. Ultimately, in terms of passenger rail, these benefits are obviously impressive. They're very measurable, and they are essential to the value statement of the mode. But ultimately, it doesn't really matter unless A, people ride the trains, and B, there's sufficient evidence to point to the fact that they're not already using something relatively clean, like a bus. Well, I'm here to tell you that A, right now, I can tell you for a fact that they will ride because they are riding right now. And I feel like contemporary passenger data that we have is from passengers riding today is tremendously overlooked. And it can tell us a lot of things about what passenger trains might do for the environment and for our economies and everything else going forward, were we to actually invest in the system in a meaningful way. And as soon as they're ready to go, because I really want these aids. Great. Yeah, no, exactly. That's just it. Yeah, no kidding. Yeah, no, it's true. Yeah. Came in at 2 a.m. on Sunday. It was great. Yeah, exactly.
Well,
perfect.
I'll tell you what, while we're waiting for that, Dan, would you grab the mic and we can jump in with comments and questions, and then we'll move back when Abe's material is ready. How's that?
It's on? Okay.
Just a quick comment, Dave, around your trucks off the road, but about 74,000 gallons of fuel less from LA to Chicago.
Dan's a lot faster than I am.
Thank you. So I was thinking about the drunk bear story. Have you all considered bridges over the tracks so that wildlife can move back and forth freely? And what are your thoughts on that?
So there are places that do that. The problem is convincing the bear to take the bridge. Not to be flippant about it, but that really is a problem. There are a lot of places, highways and rail, where they have put in crossings that either go over or under, and you have to figure out whether or not you want to funnel them there, because otherwise they cross where they want to cross. So it is something that's been considered. It's been something that's tried. In some places it works incredibly well, but it doesn't always. And in the middle of a national park, it's kind of hard because you don't want to have a huge visual disruption of the national park, so you don't want to put fences or gates or whatever to try to convince them to move to a particular place.
Let the folks over there, when your material is ready, put it up and we'll jump back.
My question is, railroads are good in building in an environmental way, and they're experienced with environmental regulations and can do it well and efficiently. for planning future passenger rail of any kind, would it be better to engage railroads earlier in the process in planning in a genuine way, so railroads can be an active participant at the front end of any planning? And could that help compress the planning timeline and make the whole planning process faster and more efficient?
Give that man a prize. Yes, you have to get the railroads involved early. They do this better than anyone else. And if you do not get them involved early, the other thing is, if you don't get their input, I mean, they're not going to care about the fact that you wasted your money. Because the fact is, they have to run a rail system, and what they're doing is really important to our country. So yeah, get them involved early, get them on your side early. If you don't, your project's not going.
I can't underline that point enough. And I mean, the freight railroads are I would argue, critical stakeholder of all the stakeholders in the process as the owners of the infrastructure. They have their own capital plans that may or may not overlap with what is necessary to deliver any of these passenger rail projects. So the earlier you can engage with the freight hosts, the better, even in an informal way. But I think that extends much further. And I think when you're trying to think in terms of NEPA and overall environmental analysis, if we're going to be relying on federal investment, it's not just the freight hosts as a stakeholder, but it's actually the resource agencies that are involved. So if you're going through Glacier, it's the National Park Service. If you're going to cross a waterway, talk to the Army Corps of Engineers. Identify the local office or the regional office points of contact. Engage them formally or informally to ensure that all of the stakeholders have the same opportunity, learn about the project at the same time, and have that same opportunity for input that will ultimately help shape a successful and deliverable project.
That's great. And Abe, it looks like your material is up.
It's really simple, and this is going to go fast, I promise. But ultimately, I hope that there are a couple of skeptics in the audience, because really, what does any of this matter if nobody rides the trains? And what does any of it matter if modal diversion is just from green modes already? Well, already, I can tell you that just in the Pacific Northwestern region, we have a rail system apart from the Cascades that essentially has walked zombie-like from the 19th century into the present day. And yet, pre-pandemic, we were carrying 2.25 million people a year, and half of that, roughly, was from the Empire Builder running on a 46-hour schedule between Chicago and Seattle, and I can say that because I've ridden it about 30 times. And then the Coast Starlight between Seattle and Los Angeles running on a 30-hour schedule. Not what you'd consider traditionally competitive modes, and yet, for what it is and what it does, I would argue that this system in our region punches above its weight. Now, there are a couple of other questions here, right? What about modal diversion? Well, Amtrak data from the mid-2010s shows us something really interesting. A really diverse source of passengers. Only 11% in the region come from a bus. That's it. We have about 43% coming from cars, and so that translates to roughly 1 million saved car trips annually. And an incredible more than a third would otherwise have flown. Now, these are numbers that I have never seen reflected in modal diversion ridership projection analysis. I think that if you were to propose something like this, especially with like a 14% inducement rate, because those are the people that are staying home that would not have traveled if the trains weren't there. If you were to propose something like this, I think you'd be laughed at some conferences, and yet this is the data that Amtrak collected at the time talking about where these passengers came from. And the environmental impact from this sort of footprint is tremendous, because look at it, the majority is from the highways and from the airports, and so it's real just with what we have now. And we haven't even tried yet. This era with this level of funding, we finally are actually going to give this a go like we have with the interstate highways and the air traffic system. So the other thing is, okay, this is pre-pandemic, right? Surely the pandemic must have changed everything. Well, let's walk through this, right? So yeah, the pandemic did change some things. This is the Capital Corridor. This is a very robust and mature service running between Sacramento and the Bay Area, Oakland, California. And you can see that blue line right there, that gigantic drop-off is the pandemic, and boy, does it fall off. But then the orange line is 2021, and the yellow line is 2022. And what do we see? Which way is the wind blowing here? Is it clawing back or is it not? Back in Washington State, we see much the same thing. This is data from WashDOT's website that stopped tracking the pandemic at about August 1st, but it's still recent enough to use. The top graph right there, you see that dotted blue line, that's the baseline from the pre-pandemic era. And the drop-off right there, this time chart comprehends 3 years, right? And it drops off in the pandemic and then slowly claws itself back to about 50% to what it was. And the crucial point here is the fact that we're not running the full Cascades corridor right now. This is representative of but 3 round trips to Portland and without trains even running to Vancouver, BC yet. So the thing is that we're seeing it. So to rephrase this, if you look at it per train, look at that. We have the pandemic ridership in orange and the previous year, 2019 ridership in blue. You can see the passengers coming back to previous levels. Now let's make this local. On Sunday, I thought, okay, I'm going to Billings. So if I was going to practice what I preach and take the train, that means I would need to go to Malta. And what if I wanted to leave tomorrow? Well, you can't do it. The Empire Builder was sold out on Monday completely. I could have paid $1,500 or roughly the price of an Alaskan cruise to get into a bedroom, but otherwise the train was sold out. Yesterday I thought, okay, well that was a Monday after a weekend, let's try it again. Oh, well look, it was sold out yesterday too. Now granted, I'm trying to buy this next day in peak season, but this is representative of something. Even though it's anecdotal, it is amazing that this 46-hour train with 40-year-old equipment that is in various states of maintenance is still attracting this kind of ridership, and this is really meaningful. Finally, to make this really work, so we have money to play with here, and we can actually begin to invest in the system, and I think that there's sufficient evidence to point to the fact that people actually will ride, and yes, they will come from places that will create meaningful environmental impact. The key now is to stop running operations and start running services. What do I mean by that? An operation is something that is run at the convenience of the operator, while a service is run at the convenience of its customers, the passengers. This is a regression I put together a while ago, and it's a little out of date. I really should update it. But this looks at state-supported Amtrak services, looking at them by ridership and the number of times daily that they run. And what I love about this is that it turned into an exponential increase in passengers per frequency, which means that you have a cheaper cost per passenger with the more service that you run. If we make it convenient, if we make it really good, then not only will the environmental benefits accrue, but so will every other kind of benefit. So I just wanted to make it really clear that these benefits are not only measurable in the NEPA sense, but also being practiced right now on the skeletal system we have today.
Thank you very much, Abe. So let's continue. We have 7 minutes to have a few more questions and comments. So what do we have out there?
So this might be a question for Abe. Your last graphic, to me, is interesting for a couple of reasons. One is because your cost per passenger goes down as your frequency goes up, right? Which is great, but your total cost also goes up. And one of the challenges that we find, I think particularly with long distance rail, is you are talking about super low frequencies and still really high costs. And so for us to get to high frequencies, your costs are going to get even higher. Your cost per unit sure goes down, but it's a matter of scale in terms of costs that I'm trying to figure out. And how do we find reasonable funding sources that can 2.2 million people a year on those services is great. But if we're talking about this being a meaningful impact on regional travel, like you get that in an afternoon,
on
right?
a couple of highway interchanges. Absolutely. Again, we haven't really tried. So this is what I get for trying to be concise. I agree that there is a bit of a disconnect between looking at state-supported Amtrak services that are running on corridors, ultra frequencies, with long-distance passenger train services. And there's a couple of other points than I normally would have made. One thing that's really interesting about Amtrak's long-distance trains is that they really punch above their weight. Per boarding, they get as many passengers per boarding as an average train on the Northeast Corridor. And in fact, their average load is far higher than Amtrak state-supported services. And I can send data afterwards if you're curious to show that. And this is more because they scale in a different way. They scale in terms of total trip pairs. The Empire Builder does amazing things because it connects so many communities and allows an exponential number of travel choices. It opens it all up. As opposed to a relatively confined single state corridor, it scales in just a different fashion. And so that's the point I would make there. I really wanted to make that point about frequency, largely because I feel like it's underappreciated in terms of making it good. How would we make long-distance trains better? Well, consistency, probably ideally daylight service in every city, and generally making the experience a little nicer than it is today. So.
Over here.
I really like the fact that you guys are talking about, if you build it, they will come type of mentality here. And it seems that we've really been focused on this long distance discussion, right? That's kind of the first step. But, when you think about what Montana is, if you can get from Billings to Missoula, driving in about 6 hours with no construction in the winter, that's worse. Maybe in the summer, you start thinking about it becomes its own separate service there. We don't have to worry about what's going from Chicago to Seattle. There's the future metrics that we should be contemplating when we talk about long-term net environmental benefits, and not just 200 people a day ride this thing from Seattle to Chicago. It could be multiple trains doing a lot of different things. They'll pull off in Livingston, change out, roll over. Right, Bill? Yep.
And of course, once you've built the infrastructure and improved the infrastructure to passenger rail standards, then you can start putting additional trains on it at very low cost.
Well, as long as we're talking the environment, are there life cycle engineering costs associated with highways that make them even more environmentally impactful, given the way they have to be maintained over 50 years versus laying down track and leaving it there?
I guess any of us could do that one.
Yeah, I think absolutely. And I think to underscore the point that you made, that is why in the NEPA context, the no impact alternative is a complete misnomer, right? There are impacts of every decision that you make, even if your decision is to not go forward with the proposed project. And I think that in comparison of passenger rail to traditional highway transportation and the need to continually maintain and expand and then maintained again and have a construction period, and not just the economic impacts of that and the constant investment and reinvestment of taxpayer dollars in an infrastructure that in many parts of this country never feels adequate and probably never will feel adequate, right? Just based on the congestion levels. There's environmental impacts, very real environmental impacts of that too, with the constant, addition of pavement and runoff and influx of construction equipment and dust. And the real damage that it does to the natural environment is very significant. So to say that, yes, in NEPA, we have to look at the no impact or the no build alternative, but it doesn't mean that alternative has no impact. It just means that there are no impacts due to the project being proposed, because the project would not be built under that alternative.
Very compelling answer. Thank you.
Yeah. If you just look at the carbon impact of redoing a highway compared to, laying down new ties or fluffing up the ballast, there's no comparison. Just from the amount of equipment that you need and the amount of time that the equipment has to be out there.
One of the things that just makes me in love with this industry is the longevity of almost every type of asset that it employs. I love finding finding spikes in ties that were installed ages ago and are finally getting, are scheduled to actually are scheduled to be replaced on multi-decade schedules, right? If you look at the equipment that Amtrak is running today, I made a joke about how it was running 40-year-old completely depreciated equipment. Well, it's still running, which is incredible, because if you look at intercity buses after 7 to 10 years, they're toast. So it's on multiple different dimensions, I'd say.
Well, thank you so much to the panel and to all of the folks that had great questions, and we appreciate the opportunity to chat with you.